Want to begin first just thanking Slow Factory, thanking everyone on the team there for offering up this time and this space, and also a big gratitude to everybody who's watching here right now and everyone who will be watching the recording. I really appreciate it. Um, so the topic today is fashion and spirituality, and in line with that, I wanted to start off reading a Lakota prayer just to sort of center all of us and get us on this kind of wavelength. Wakantanka, great mystery. Teach me how to trust my heart, my mind, my intuition, my inner knowing, the senses of my body, the blessings of my spirit. Teach me to trust these things so that I may enter my sacred space and love beyond my fear, and thus walk in balance with the passing of each glorious sun. So this is a spiritually guided space, as the topic suggests, I hope. And, of course, we're approaching all of these ideas from different perspectives. We might come from different faith backgrounds. In fact, we definitely come from different faith backgrounds and different sort of spiritual contexts and backgrounds and beliefs. So I think it's important that we recognize that and acknowledge that, but also that we are, probably have a lot more in common than we have differences. So sort of keeping that in mind, and these are also really my reflections on this topic. It's not meant to be any sort of absolute declarative message. So a little bit about me. My name is Anisa. My spiritual background is that I'm a Baha'i. I'm a member of the Baha'i faith. And I'm aware that many people have maybe never heard of the Baha'i faith. So just as sort of a super brief description, the Baha'i faith is an independent religion that is really centered on this notion of the oneness of mankind. We believe that there is, in addition to sort of this oneness of humanity, there's also a sort of a oneness in God and of spirituality, that all these different branches of faith are really extensions from one spiritual source. And that the purpose of our individual spiritual development is so that we can better serve those around us and make a difference in the world. In terms of my professional background, I have a past in fashion, and I currently work in the art world. I work as a writer and a creative strategist. And I also have a project publication that's a little bit on pause now that was about sort of collecting stories of people's faith and belief and spirituality. So this is a topic that really interests me, both sort of looking at creative work as well as just understanding kind of how do we connect with what is really this great mystery, as the prayer alludes. So here is an overview of what we will be discussing today. The big thing is that, fashion is an opportunity to reflect our inner reality through our material body. So when we talk about fashion and spirituality, that's kind of what I am focusing on today, is thinking about sort of where do fashion and spirituality intersect? How can we as individuals reflect these spiritual values through fashion, through clothing? This link between beauty and consumerism, and then ultimately sort of what is our individual responsibility. As sort of an overarching concept, there's this idea of let deeds, not words, be your adorning. So really leading in action. In a Baha'i context, I think it's also important for me to note, because of course that's the angle that I'm approaching this at. In terms of clothing, it is left to the discretion of the individual. So there's no sort of prescriptive guidance on what you should wear, but that, these should all be, these decisions are ones that have to be made based on cultural values, on practicality, daily needs, climate, things like that. So this is definitely not a setting where you are being told what to wear. It's more about how you wear it. So related to this first question of where do fashion and spirituality intersect, I think it's important to preface it also with this notion that spirituality is about interconnectedness. So it's about how our personal talents, our spheres of influence, all of these things come together, and if you wear clothing, this is again sort of an arena where spiritual ideals can meet up with what we wear, because spirituality, because it's everything is all interconnected. I want to read this quote about Grace Lee Boggs because, of course, being fans of Slow Factory, we are here for a revolution. We are here for change. So she says, to make a revolution, people must not only struggle against existing institutions, they must make a philosophical/spiritual leap and become more human beings. In order to change and transform the world, they must change and transform themselves. So as we are focused on changing the world, we are also looking at how we can create personal decisions that align with those values that we hold. And every material thing has a spiritual counterpart. So as I said earlier, fashion is how we reflect our inner self through our material body. And it can be used to demonstrate things like aesthetic taste, gender identity, gender expression, find community. And just as those things are really individual, so is spirituality, which is really sort of this personal journey of discovery and a constant process of growth and search, and isn't sort of finite as well. And I also personally believe that every material thing has a spiritual counterpart. So you can think of, just as we feed our physical body with food, we feed our spiritual self with prayer and meditation. You can look at the parallel of love and gravity, both as forces of attraction. So then surely fashion and clothing could also reflect these sort of spiritual values and ideas. The question is, how can fashion reflect these spiritual values and ideas? Because I think it's important that when thinking about something that might seem really abstract, we put that into tangible, kind of ideas as well. It's funny, in the chat, there were some guessing and some sort of people were sharing ideas of how they reflect fashion and spirituality, which I think is really wonderful and really important, because I think this is also a question where it's up to each person to kind of think through what it means for themselves. So when I talk about spiritual values, here is a short list of ones that come to mind for me. Compassion, which is really about feeling love and empathy and care towards others. Generosity, which is a sort of a spirit of open giving, not just material giving, I think, but also in our actions, in our time. Reciprocity, that we're not in this alone, that we help other people and they help us, and but that's also without expectation of return. Moderation, so a rejection of excess and extremes, which I think is really relevant here, because when we talk about fashion, we can think about fast fashion, we can think about things that are these excessive prices, things that are draining on our environment, and all of these can exhibit qualities. We can sort of change the way we think about these components to exhibit qualities of moderation. Beauty, which is maybe one of the most important ones from my perspective, and one that we'll explore a lot further, because beauty, we often think of it as just something being pretty, but it really is so much deeper than that. And then usefulness, because I think that's something that we forget as being a spiritual quality, that there is power in usefulness, because we're not simply on this earth to care about ourselves, we're also on this earth to care about others. And so when the decisions that we make reflect that, then I think that really adds to our spiritual contribution to the world as well. So when we talk about beauty, again, it's not just about what's pretty, but it's about this attraction to beauty as a spiritual quality. I think it's a really kind of a stunning mystery that we as human beings are drawn to beautiful things and are drawn to creativity. And I really see this as reflections of the capacity of the soul. throughout all time and all space, throughout the world, people have been making art and creating beautiful things. And I think that's a testament to our spiritual reality and how important it is for us to both express beauty and to receive beauty. And that it can't be kind of undermined as something frivolous, which is very common when thinking about fashion. You know, I remember growing up kind of feeling uncomfortable almost in my interest in the topic because it felt so trivial. It felt like it was something that only existed on this material plane, when of course we know, you know, our soul needs beauty and is drawn to it. And there are components of this industry that don't reflect that, but there are so many ways that we can sort of shift our perspective to prioritize this. I also want to highlight this quote from the Baha'i writings that talks about the spirit and the heart's pleasure and enjoyment, and the importance of you know, finding beauty where we can, and that it doesn't have to come from only one source, that it can come from your home, a garden, a beautiful line, something as simple as a beautiful line or a pleasing garment. And how when we pivot ourselves towards beauty, we create, you know, also a spiritual experience in ourselves, even as subtle as it might be. I think about, you know, also when I see, you know, a tall mountain, or I'm in a forest, or I see an act of compassion between two strangers, that also can be a moment of beauty that is really rooted in spiritual values. But beauty, as we understand it in our society, is not often that. So Toni Morrison says, the concept of physical beauty as a virtue is one of the dumbest, most pernicious and destructive ideas in the Western world, and we should have nothing to do with it. And I love this quote because it is so extreme. Dumbest, pernicious, most destructive. And I think it's important also to contend with the fact that usually when we're thinking of beauty, this is what comes to mind. When we think of the fast fashion industry, when we think about the environmental toll of the fashion industry, when we think about the sort of labor violations and unfair practices that exist in this industry, it is a reflection of this. It is a reflection of this sort of obsession with physical beauty. You can even think about the skin bleaching industries. You can think about the you know, the vilification of Black hair, that this sort of narrow definition and narrow concept of physical beauty is this incredibly restrictive thing that dictates something that only exists in your outer shell, not in your inner being, and how ultimately it becomes very unfulfilling to be chasing that, very unfulfilling to always be chasing the next trend or trying to sort of catch up to what you see around you, and weigh your value based on that, because that value is so fleeting. But Toni Morrison also has more to say about beauty, because she, of course, we know is someone who creates beauty through her words. So she says, I think of beauty as an absolute necessity. I don't think it's a privilege or an indulgence. It's not even a quest. I think it's almost like knowledge, which is to say, it's what we were born for. I think finding, incorporating, and then representing beauty is what humans do, with or without authorities telling us what it is. I think it would exist in any case. The startle and the wonder of being in this place. Some of it's natural, some of it's man-made, some of it is a mere glance. It's an absolute necessity. I don't think we can do without it any more than we can do without dreams or oxygen. I especially appreciate the comparison between the first quote and this one, because the first one might suggest that she doesn't care about beauty, but the second one clarifies that it is the most precious thing. And this really calls to mind this notion that every material thing has a spiritual counterpart, where even we can think about the material sense of beauty versus a spiritual sense of beauty and understanding of beauty. You know, because it's essential to the expression and the flourishing of the soul. When we think about sort of how you feel when you wear something that feels important to you, whether it's sentimental or it just looks amazing. There is, maybe a physical impact because you have this thing on or whatever, but the sort of spiritual internal impact is so much greater and so much more sustaining. And, I think it also is the sense where she talks about with or without authorities telling us what it is. This to me calls to this notion that beauty really can reflect our cultural values. Diverse and vast aesthetics can exist and should exist and are things that add to our sense of culture and community, that we don't have to sort of conform to one standard that is dictated to us, but that we can really be agents in deciding, what do I find beautiful? What brings this sense of awe to me? And then the photo is one that I've seen shared around. It's of Toni Morrison and Angela Davis in the 70s walking together on the street. And oftentimes what I see people noting it for is how amazing they look, which is what first drew me to the photo, because I know, the work of these women, but to see them look that good kind of makes me love them more. And these are people who are known for their minds. They are, they're not people who are revered for their physical body, but for their internal qualities. And it also demonstrates that what we wear and how we present ourselves and the way that we express and seek beauty can be reflective of these wider qualities. So we think about, the symbol of the Afro and Black Power movement, how powerful that is, as a sort of something that symbolizes something to somebody else, but also a rejection of this sort of restrictive authority that might dictate what is beautiful to a small group of people. We also see this expressed oftentimes in art, in music and other sort of forms. But what I think is distinct about expressing it in fashion is that it carries with you. Like as you move, as you're wearing something, this expression of beauty that you have decided for yourself moves in space with you. Whereas if you create a beautiful painting to express this, it might stay still as a singular object. And I think that's really powerful. And I think we often sort of undercut the significance of that. A lot of it, I think, is gendered, and people based on class and race and gender expression are judged, of course, on what they choose to wear and how they choose to express themselves. And I think it's important that we really investigate how we are defining beauty and what sources are determining the definitions that we set. So in the case of what Toni Morrison expresses, it's really about moving ourselves away from this narrow sense of a physical beauty that is destructive and moving towards the necessity of beauty, which, as she says, it's not a privilege, it's not an indulgence, you shouldn't feel bad about it. But that it is a spiritual expression. Perhaps it's an act of creativity, but definitely it is something to feed your soul. And there are so many questions about sort of how that is expressed that I think are also really personal. So this, also brings up the topic of, in order to have clothes for most people, you have to buy clothes. And that often beauty is tied up in consumerism, and the values that we hold in terms of determining whether things are beautiful or not is often tied up with cost and class and status and symbols of status that are really tied to this notion of a physical beauty. But beauty is of value to our lives and of value to our spiritual well-being. So I think it is sort of it's an interesting, maybe lifelong challenge of separating these two ideas from one another. The notion, sort of really internalizing the notion that beauty is not just pretty. It's not just something that is pretty, but it's something that reflects these spiritual principles. So it's investigating for yourself, what does beauty look like in a context of justice, in a context of compassion, in a context of reciprocity? In what ways can beauty be evolved in our own minds, because of course that's what we can control, to reflect these qualities? And the reality is that if the beauty that we see and that we experience only really applies to a very small group of people, then surely it cannot be a beauty that is just, a beauty that is reciprocal, a beauty that is compassionate, etc. And it's exciting to me to be able to redefine these values for yourself and shift the way that we think about these notions that feel very common, but can be investigated so much deeper. So this is another quote. It's a little bit of a long one by Bell Hooks. She says, "Beauty can be and is present in our lives, irrespective of our class status. Learning to see and appreciate the presence of beauty is an act of resistance in a culture of domination that recognizes the production of a pervasive feeling of lack, both material and spiritual, as a useful colonizing strategy. Individuals who feel constant lack will consume more, will submit more readily. We need to theorize the meaning of beauty in our lives so that we can educate for critical consciousness, talking through the issues, how we acquire and spend money, how we feel about beauty, what the space of beauty is in our lives when we lack material privilege, and even basic resources for living, the meaning and significance of luxury, and the politics of envy." And I kind of just want to like sit with that for a moment because it's a lot and there's so many points that are being made here. So we know that fashion has the ability to reflect beauty, but it has to, as Toni Morrison says, go beyond this notion of a physical beauty. And kind of, transcend to the station of a necessity. And when we understand beauty beyond the notion of consumerism, it has the ability to do that. And this is sort of what Bell Hooks is talking about here. And I want to bring attention to the very end of the quote and the importance of sort of talking through these issues. And I do think this is mostly a personal process. Of considering these might be a community process, but it is definitely not a prescriptive process. So there is not a one-size-fits-all solution to any of this. But I think thinking about how we feel about beauty, the space of beauty in our individual lives, its significance, its politics are important considerations in transforming our perspective. Because when we think critically about the things that we take for granted, then we're able to, really radically transform our relationship to these things. Because fashion is never going away, beauty is never going away, art is never going away, music's never going away, film and theater and all these, dance, all these forms and reflections of beauty will never leave, these expressions of creativity. But it's about transforming our relationship to them, and that's sort of how we spiritualize these processes and spiritualize the ideas. It's not doing away with it. It's not getting rid of it. It's not that everybody should wear, a brown sack and become sort of monotonous, homogenous, and forget about their individual aesthetic tastes and character traits. But it's about, encapsulating this notion of beauty that Bell Hooks and Toni Morrison describe, that is really sort of a radical approach that sees it from the level of the soul and gives it that weight of importance. So I think, it's this culture of constant consumerism that really shifts us away from spiritual understanding. I found it really interesting when I read Bell Hooks's book, All About Love, that she defines the opposite of love, not as hate, but as greed. And so when we live in a culture of greed, we live in a culture that is almost incapable of exhibiting love, which is very powerful and has very, extreme repercussions. So when we're centered on consumerism, our individual lives are centered on our material needs as opposed to our spiritual needs, and so we become almost consumed by self-indulgence, by self in general. And the danger is that we lose the opportunity to consider these ideas from a more critical lens, because we're constantly sort of in this cycle of trying to catch up or compete or alter ourselves for the sake of others as opposed to for the sake of ourselves. And, when we are obsessed with acquiring more and more, our consideration for others is lessened as well, because we really turn ourselves wholly towards our own needs, and that's incredibly dangerous. Bringing it back to this notion of fast fashion as well, this is where disregard for environmental consequence or labor practices, sort of gets washed away in the desire to constantly acquire. And there's sort of this deception that this acquisition somehow at some point will get you to a feeling of contentment, when in fact the structures are designed to ever prevent that from happening. They're designed to constantly feed this desire to consume and consume and consume, and look around at what other people are wearing and try to copy that and emulate that, which is incredibly dangerous, because it creates this feeling of never being enough. And if you're never enough, then you can never sort of serve others, and never sort of approach your own sort of station from a position of humility. So with that, I mean, there's also sort of this trick, I think, of, even when we talk about sort of sustainable brands, they're still feeding into this culture of consumerism. They're still wanting you to constantly buy, and you have to make trade-offs. I think that's sort of inevitable and the reality. But we also can't become so desensitized that we don't sort of engage in these critical questions and conversations. So, the next question is then what does beauty look like in the context of justice? When we think about, okay, well then what can we do? How can we transform it? So in the Baha'i writings, there is this quote that talks a bit about the purpose of justice, that says it is, the process of justice, and by its aid thou shalt see through thine own eyes and not through the eyes of others, and shalt know of thine own knowledge and not through the knowledge of thy neighbor. That it is our responsibility as individuals to investigate for ourselves and consider for ourselves what these things mean. And I think what stands out to me thinking about this in the context of bell hooks is this questioning and this investigation, to always be sort of in a process of investigation and consideration. Because I think when you begin to take things for granted, then you kind of become numb to the consequences. The work of art that is up right now, El Anatsui's Ink Splash, is a favorite work of mine. He's one of my favorite artists. He's a Ghanaian artist who's based in Nigeria. And the works that he creates are made of flattened and shaped liquor bottle caps that are stitched together with copper wire, and create these beautiful works that look incredibly luxurious. And especially when light is shown on them, the material really transforms. I mean, it begins as trash, as kind of the lowest form of waste, and becomes beautiful, beautiful art that is hanging in, the top museums of the world. And this to me is an example of beauty in a context of justice, where we are able to investigate our own reality, see with our own eyes, and transform our relationship to consumption and to beauty and to production as well, where we are allowing our own imagination to lead instead of allowing what is dictated by others to lead. So another kind of example that I want to pull that's more about fashion is also thinking about process, again, as I mentioned with the El Anatsui work, sort of this slowing down this process of consumerism, because I also think it's unrealistic for us to never acquire. We know that there are things like the zero waste movement that are incredibly elitist and make assumptions about, being able to buy these expensive containers and products and things without really considering, the ways that people are making a difference in their own lives, in their own contexts. So things like, purchasing less, or this is an example of a brand that utilizes artisans to create fabrics, woven fabrics, knits, different patterns and things like that. They're based in Peru, and they use sort of local methods in order to create what they create. And this is sort of, like an example of just sort of slowing everything down in the process. And really considering this holistic ecosystem that exists behind a single garment, of how it was designed, how it was produced, how it's distributed, what is being communicated by the brand. Are they, putting out hundreds of items of clothing every month, or are they, slowly giving spurts as to, express their own creativity without being excessive? And there also brings back this notion, the importance of moderation. So then the question that it brings us to is, well, then what can we do? What can we as individual people really do to link these ideas of fashion and spirituality in our own lives? So I would say we can spiritualize the approach. To bring it back to Grace Lee Boggs, who we heard one quote from, she says, "When you read Marx or Jesus this way, you come to see that real wealth is not material wealth, and real poverty is not just the lack of food, shelter, and clothing. Real poverty is the belief that the purpose of life is acquiring wealth and owning things. Real wealth is not the possession of property, but the recognition that our deepest need as human beings is to keep developing our natural and acquired powers to relate to other human beings." So just as we redefine what beauty means, we also need to redefine what wealth means, where some kind of a obsession with acquiring wealth doesn't become an obsession with acquiring things, or even for people who have acquired material wealth, not becoming obsessed or defined by that, but really centering ourselves on our ability to relate to others and connect with others, and be of service to the people around us and the world that we live in. And it's really creating sort of an awareness of our habits. So noticing, why do you tend to buy things? When do you tend to buy things? What do you tend to wear, and why do you tend to wear them? Kind of where did you learn that something was beautiful? Why do you think it's beautiful? And investigating through your individual process of justice, through your individual search, through seeing with your own eye and hearing with your own ear, how these things serve your spiritual well-being, thinking about sort of who does it serve, or what does it serve, that I approach something in the way that I approach it. It's also, I think, though, another sort of notion of moderation is not falling into extreme behaviors where you might go from constantly buying stuff to paying absolutely no attention, but it's about sort of practicing balance, constantly being in a process of practicing balance. I have up here a photo of Telfar Clemens, the designer of the brand Telfar, and these very iconic bags that are at least super popular in New York, and I know elsewhere. And this to me is really an example of somebody who has cultivated their brand to be abundantly inclusive. And how this brand has been able to do that is through the images that they produce, but also through the messages that they send and the policies that they put in place. So their priority is really with making sure that everybody has access to their products, and by thwarting scarcity and this exclusivity mindset that breeds competition and comparison, they've said, everyone can have our products. Everybody can have access, that will communicate very clearly when drops are happening. They had a program over the summer where they said, put an order in for any bag, any size, and we'll ship it to you in a couple months. And I think, that's a practice where, yes, there's demand and they're producing a lot of products, but they're not seeing it in a context of exclusivity where there's sort of this tight club and you're in or you're out. But it's about sort of customizing something to your individual context, and allowing sort of whoever wants access to it, which I think is definitely a reflection of these spiritual ideals, in not, again, sort of feeding this dragon of comparison that often sort of compels us to be buying more and more and more because we always feel on the outside. But when we feel like we're on the inside, then I think there's sort of a bit of room to breathe because our focus is shifted. So this quote was on the very first slide of the presentation, and we're bringing it back. Let deeds, not words, be your adorning. The notion of adornment is what sort of draws me to connect this quote to what we're talking about. Thinking about the decoration that we might place on our body, or the way that our is seen by other people, is interpreted by other people. An adornment is really something that enhances. So whether it is our, putting on an earring or some eyeshadow, or expressing, loving kindness towards others, I think these are really, can all be seen as potential adornments. But when we allow deeds and not words to be our adorning, we are leading with action instead of with idle talk. So even when we think about our relationship to fashion, it's about making sure that whatever we sort of believe in, whatever we preach, that we're backing it up with action, and it's not just words. It's not about judging other people or criticizing other people's decisions, but it's about sort of stepping first, into what we believe and what we hold, which is so much more powerful than sort of a chime of opinions, which doesn't cut through anything or make a real difference. Another quote, another concept is, beautify your tongues, O people, with truthfulness, and adorn your souls with the ornament of honesty. So this is back to beauty, but it's beauty through truthfulness. It's demonstrating that, when we express these qualities, we really are creating beauty in the world, and in ourselves, and that we have the ability to sort of embody honesty. Sort of imagine if, like an earring, we could put on this ornament of honesty, and how that really communicates so much stronger than, a physical earring, maybe. But it's also, when we talk about truthfulness, we talk about honesty, I think it's also calling to mind this notion that none of this stuff is prescriptive. There's not an easy answer, there's not an easy solution, but it really takes an effort to be in a constant reflection on what these ideas mean. It's bringing yourself to account. It is taking the time to consider the how and the why and the what of the decisions that we make, because fashion is beautiful, and by being beautiful, it can be imbued with spiritual qualities. I think it's important to sort of call out too that, again, that we do what works for us, and that we don't pass judgment towards other people and the decisions that they make. Just like our spiritual processes are very individual, so are our sartorial ones. And we interpret the same words and situations and behaviors differently. So, when we think about, even fast fashion or sort of a lower price point clothing versus sort of the more quote unquote sustainable brands that are at a higher price point, not everybody can afford those. And so it's unrealistic. It's classist, it's discriminatory to say that you're a bad person if you don't wear this brand, or if you do wear this brand. But it's about coming to a sort of a balance. I shouldn't say coming to a balance. It's about practicing balance, because I don't think balance is something that is a final point that we arrive at. It's something that we're sort of constantly making an effort of, in order to reflect the qualities that we choose to reflect. And I know that through the course of this presentation, I talked about a lot of different things, but I think if I would end on any notion, it would be that, if we create a broader sense of what beauty means to ourselves as individuals, and we're each practicing this, then we are sort of creating I think, more love in the world. And we are creating change. We are creating revolutionary change, as Bell Hooks said, sort of by turning to beauty as an absolute necessity, as investigating beauty and rejecting consumerism from sort of this sort of broader perspective, we engage in acts of change and potentially even revolution, in revolutionizing our relationship to our material world through what we understand from a spiritual level. And I think that is the end of my presentation. I want to just extend a huge thanks again to everyone at Slow Factory, to Veronica, and to all of you. And now we can go into questions. And I want to also just point out, if people are interested in getting in touch, on the bottom is my Instagram handle and my email address. And thank you.
Nafisa asks, can we add thrift clothing in spirituality? If yes, then how?
I would say that's been one of the answers that I've found. Most of the clothing that I wear and that I buy is thrifted or secondhand. And I think by sort of removing ourselves from like the production side, where we're not encouraging sort of the production of new clothing, I have found that that's sort of a way to reflect these spiritual values, absolutely. And I think it also feeds into this notion of slowing down the process, where I found that definitely for me, it's a lot harder to find an item of clothing that you love from a thrift store than it is to find it from a store that has a very specific aesthetic catered towards what you like. And so I think it makes us think a lot more critically and more consciously about what we buy and why we buy it, and the choices that we make. And then even there are ways to, seek out thrift stores that are, like charity shops or that serve communities in some capacity, and really, use our money towards the benefit of a community.
Sarah is asking, which kind of builds on your current answer, what kind of things do you look for or think through when buying clothing or material items?
Mm-hmm. As I mentioned before, I tend to get things that are secondhand, although I don't always, because sometimes there's a need that, it's difficult to fulfill from that setting. I think I definitely look at beauty. Do I like something? I think that's really important. Usefulness is also very important. So thinking through, can I wear an outfit with this item with other things that I already own? Will I actually get use out of it is really important. And I think gauging, if you're able to try something on, which in these times often dressing rooms are closed, really gauging, like, how do you feel in this moment? Because I think, I've definitely experienced, I'll go into a dressing room and I'll try something on and I feel okay in it, but I kind of still want to get it instead of being really, truly honest with myself. And, it's almost like a practice of mindfulness, of like really being in the moment, really being honest with yourself and thinking about, okay, is this really, like, do I actually feel good in this, or do I just aspire to feel good in this? Bringing those questions, those critical questions, into our processes of acquiring new things. And I'm going to stop sharing just so we can sort of maybe see each other better.
Michelle asks, do you think natural materials compared to synthetic man-made ones make humans feel different? I love this question.
I think that is a complicated one, because the most ethical or sustainable item of clothing is the one that's already in your closet, the one that you already own. Because even if it's something is made of natural materials or organic cotton or whatever it is, it still is feeding into these processes of production and consumerism and labor and whatever. But I think there is something special about, I find, like a natural material. Of course, we know that when we wash synthetic materials, it releases microplastics into water systems. But there is also something special to think about the land, the bounty of the land and this earth that we live on the way that nature sustains us and feeds us and clothes us and houses us. That is really beautiful when you think about sort of when we wear cotton or linen or one of these fabrics, as opposed to a synthetic that might contain, petroleum products in it. But I think it's also important to consider the uses, of all that we do. Like, you probably can't exercise easily in wool, um, but it's, sort of making adjustments where you can, and also being really gentle and patient with yourself.
Katie says, thank you for this lecture. I have been thinking a lot about the spiritual emptiness of modern capitalistic society, how that's reflected in hyper consumptionism and injustice, and how to start healing. I'm curious about how you think about starting to restore spirituality and a deep sense of humanity on justice on a societal level when that's such an inherently individual process.
Mm. Um, yeah, big question. I think is it's about patience. Um, I was recently reading a text that talked about the three attributes of perfection. And the first attribute of perfection was learning. The second attribute of perfection was justice. And the third attribute is the sincere sharing of your knowledge. So I think that is really the process. That's really sort of where I see change happening, is in our own commitment to learning, our commitment to better understanding and exhibiting justice, and our willingness to share what we learn with other people. If we are existing in silos, or we discount people for the decisions that we make, then we can't come to create collective growth. Because it really needs to be collective. It needs to be mutual. It needs to be reciprocal. It needs to be cooperative. But that is going to be slow, and it also will inevitably be difficult, because when cast aside old structures, it's going to have, sort of difficult realities to face. For me, this process is also inherently spiritual. It requires sort of coming to see each other on the spiritual level, as ultimately as spiritual beings. And I think it was really interesting to me when I reread the autobiography of Malcolm X. It stood out to me that he, at the end of the book, talks about how he really sees the coming together of humanity as an inherently spiritual process, and that we need spiritual teachings in order to guide us in this process. And when I look at individuals, this is why I love to read, the works of James Baldwin or Bell Hooks or Grace Lee Boggs, these incredible thinkers and activists who've created real change in this world, to see how deeply spiritual their writing is, because it is such a reminder that this work doesn't only exist on a material level, that it goes a lot deeper than that. And it's important also that we consider those levels to the work that we do as individuals every day.
Odette asks, do you think that the notion of an individualized beauty is what has got us in the place of skewed beauty that we are in? People thinking that they know everything may be the problem. Has God/spirituality already defined the quote better, not perfect notion of beauty?
To look at the beginning of the question about sort of an individualized notion of beauty, I think it's about maybe a restricted sense of beauty. So this is about power. It's about expressions of power, really. So looking at patriarchy or white supremacy or imperialism that have dictated what people are allowed to wear and how they're allowed to wear it. So, I mentioned before the vilification of natural Black hair textures, the sort of choking out of indigenous cultures and aesthetics, which are also deeply linked to spirituality and prayer, and then, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, all over the world. which is very dangerous. And I think for a long time, especially when these processes were maybe more actively being established, um, they were seen as being rooted in spirituality, or not, I shouldn't say spirituality, being rooted in some kind of a religious understanding, which might for some people be a spiritual understanding, but not always. And I think the consequence of that is we sort of confuse the interpretation of a human being with the spiritual reality, which is not the case at all. Um, from a Baha'i perspective, I understand that unity is not uniformity, and absolutely reject the notion that there is a sort of a single standard that we all have to conform to. I think that is incredibly dangerous. In there's an interview that I really love between two Baha'i women who are also Lakota, and they talk about the incorporation of um, Lakota dress and practices and prayer and language, and how it's all linked. It's all one. If we understand that there is one sort of spiritual thread, then uh, surely we can sort of weave that thread into our reality, how in the way that it fits. Um, so I think it's about sort of coming to a more universal understanding of what spirituality even means.
Lizzie Clark says, how important do you see spirituality in terms of accelerating a sustainable world?
I think it is very spiritual, this process of creating a more sustainable world, because it's an acknowledgement of interconnectedness. Spirituality is a recognition that we exist beyond our physical, our reality is more than our physical reality, our physical body, which is bound by limits of time and space and everything else. Whereas our spiritual reality is sort of a limitless dip into infinity, which maybe we definitely don't have access to all of it. We can't really know the reality of it. We can just sort of maybe draw closer to it. And I think moving towards sustainability, I see it as a very similar thing, where we don't do it for ourselves. We do it for the recognition of interconnectedness and an acknowledgement that time extends far beyond our own existence. It is also an expression of deep care and humility, where we don't see ourselves as dominating over nature, but we see ourselves as stewards of the natural world. So yeah, I think it's very spiritual, but it also, again, can be very individual in the choices that we make.
Well, thank you so much, Anisa, for such a thoughtful and interesting class. I think we all have a lot that we are going to be sitting with for today and probably the weekend. Thank you, Veronica. And yeah, if there are any last few words, Anisa, that you'd like to share with the class before we finish, please go ahead.
Just an abundance of gratitude. Thank you to everybody. Thank you to you, Yasmin, for moderating so beautifully. Thank you to Celine. Thank you to all of it. Thank you to the mystery of it all. And I hope that we can all continue in our investigation and in our search towards justice.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, everyone. We hope to see you next week again. Thank you, Anisa and Veronica, once again. And happy Friday. If wherever you are in the world, I hope you have a beautiful rest of your day, night, morning, and enjoy the weekend. We'll see you next week. Bye.